Sometimes the war ended for one person long before it ended for the world. In the spring of 1945, the air over eastern Germany carried a strange silence, the kind that comes after years of noise finally grow tired of themselves. And in a small town near the Elbe River, that silence settled over broken roofs, empty bakeries, and streets where the dust had begun to cover the footprints of soldiers who would never return. The war was not officially over yet, not on the maps, not in the newspapers, but in places like this it had already exhausted itself. Buildings leaned against the sky like tired men. Windows stared out without glass. And in the middle of a collapsed square, beside what had once been a bakery wall, a young woman knelt in the rubble and searched with the slow patience of someone who had nothing left to lose. Her name was Anna Fisher. She was 23 years old, though hunger had carved years into her face that no calendar had recorded. Before the war, she had been a schoolteacher. She had spent her mornings explaining arithmetic to children and her afternoons correcting handwriting in neat rows of notebooks. The classroom had smelled of chalk dust and apples from a nearby orchard. That life now felt like something she had dreamed as a child and forgotten when she woke. The bakery behind her had belonged to her father. For 30 years, he had baked dark rye loaves that filled the street with warm bread every morning at 6. People from 3 blocks away used to follow that smell like a compass. But war has a way of turning familiar things into ghosts. By the winter of 1945, the ovens were cold, the windows shattered, and the bakery floor buried under bricks the color of dried clay. Anna brushed dust away with both hands and leaned closer to the broken stones. She was not looking for treasure. She was looking for grain. Sometimes a few kernels of wheat remained trapped in the cracks of old flour sacks or scattered between bricks where the bakery shelves had once stood. The grains were tiny, hardly worth the effort for someone who had strength left in her body. But Anna did not have strength. She had determination. Her fingers moved slowly across the ground, collecting what little the war had forgotten. One grain, then another. She placed them in her palm and watched them like a scientist studying something fragile and rare. Hunger had reduced the world to small measurements. 1 grain meant a few seconds more standing. 10 grains meant another hour of breathing without dizziness. A handful meant hope. She had not eaten a full meal in days. The last real bread she remembered tasting had been sometime in March. Now it was late April, and the town around her had begun to look less like a place where people lived and more like a photograph of something that used to exist. The wind moved through empty windows and carried the smell of damp stone and distant river water. Somewhere down the street, a loose metal sign tapped softly against a wall. Tap. Pause. Tap again. Even the sound seemed tired. Anna shifted her weight and felt the weakness move through her legs like cold water. When she stood up too quickly, the world sometimes tilted sideways, and the sky became brighter than it should be. She knew the signs. Hunger taught its lessons quietly but thoroughly. She paused and pressed her hand against the broken wall beside her. The brick felt warm from the morning sun. Warmth was another small victory. In the distance, beyond the edge of the town square, a faint mechanical sound drifted across the quiet. An engine, low and steady. It did not belong to tractors or delivery trucks. Those sounds had disappeared months ago. This one was different. Military. The sound grew louder as it moved closer, rolling slowly along the cracked road that led into town. Anna did not turn immediately. During the war, people learned to measure their reactions carefully. Quick movements invited attention. Attention invited questions. Questions sometimes invited trouble. She kept her eyes on the ground and continued brushing dust aside with her fingers. The engine approached. Gravel shifted under tires. Then the vehicle stopped somewhere behind her. For a moment, nothing happened. The engine idled. A door opened with a short metallic click. Boots touched the ground. American boots, though Anna did not yet know that for certain. She could hear the difference in their rhythm. The step of someone used to moving across long distances. Calm. Controlled. The boots came closer, crossing the square slowly as if the man wearing them had all the time in the world. Anna felt the shadow before she saw it. A darker shape falling across the rubble beside her hands. She looked up. The soldier standing a few feet away seemed tall against the pale sky. His uniform was dusty from travel, his sleeves rolled halfway to his elbows. The patch on his shoulder carried a symbol she did not recognize yet. His face was sunburned in the way farmers sometimes looked after long weeks outdoors. He studied the scene in front of him quietly, not with suspicion, not with anger, but with the careful curiosity of someone trying to understand something unexpected. Sergeant Daniel Carter had crossed half of Europe in the past year, and he had seen many towns reduced to silence. But the sight of a woman kneeling in the rubble and collecting grains of wheat from broken bricks made him stop in a way the others had not. She looked impossibly thin, not fragile like porcelain, but light like paper. The bones of her wrists showed beneath skin that had lost its color weeks ago. He recognized the look immediately. Daniel Carter had grown up in Oklahoma during the years when drought turned fields into dust and hunger visited farms like an unwelcome relative who stayed too long. He knew the quiet signs, the slow movements, the careful breathing, the way a person measured every step because energy had become a currency too valuable to waste. The woman raised her eyes toward him. They were pale blue and clear despite the exhaustion surrounding them. For a second, neither of them spoke. War had trained people to expect many things from enemies. Kindness was rarely on the list. Daniel reached slowly into the pocket of his field jacket. The movement made Anna's shoulders tense slightly, but she did not move away. His hand emerged holding a small rectangular object wrapped in brown paper. Chocolate. Standard issue D ration. 4 ounces. Soldiers often joke that it tasted like chalk and cocoa mixed together. But calories were calories, and in a world that had forgotten bread, even ordinary chocolate could look like a miracle. Daniel looked at the woman again, then at the grains of wheat in her palm. He understood the arithmetic of hunger without asking a single question. The war had drawn lines across maps and uniforms, but hunger ignored those borders completely. For a moment he simply stood there, the chocolate resting quietly in his hand, while the spring wind moved through the empty square and the distant river carried the slow promise that somewhere beyond the broken town the world was already beginning to start again. Daniel Carter held the chocolate in his hand for a moment longer, not offering it yet, simply letting the small brown package exist between them like a quiet question. The woman did not reach for it. Her fingers still held the few grains of wheat she had gathered, and she looked at the chocolate with the cautious attention of someone who had learned that unexpected gifts sometimes carried hidden costs. The wind moved softly through the empty square, lifting a little dust from the broken stones. Somewhere far down the road a loose shutter tapped once against a wall and then settled again. Daniel slowly unwrapped the paper from the chocolate bar. The movement was deliberate, calm, almost routine. The paper made a dry rustling sound in the still air. Anna watched his hands. She had seen soldiers before, many kinds of soldiers, and each army had its own language of motion. Some moved quickly, some moved with tension. This one moved like a farmer working in a field, patient and unhurried, as though nothing in the world required sudden decisions. When the chocolate was exposed, he broke off a small square piece with his thumb and forefinger. Then he lifted it to his mouth and ate it. He chewed slowly, looking not at her but at the horizon beyond the ruined street, giving the moment time to breathe. Anna studied him. Hunger sharpened observation. A starving person noticed details others ignored. The way his shoulders remained relaxed. The way his eyes did not search the streets for threat. The way he finished chewing before speaking, as though conversation and eating both deserved their own quiet space. Daniel swallowed, and then extended the remaining piece of chocolate toward her. He did not step closer. He simply held it where she could reach it if she wanted. Anna hesitated. For a second, she felt the old voice of propaganda whispering inside her memory, the voice that had filled classrooms and radio broadcasts for years. Americans were cruel. Americans would humiliate prisoners. Americans would use kindness as a trap. That voice had been repeated so many times it had begun to sound like truth. Yet the man standing in front of her did not resemble the image that voice described. He looked tired from travel. Dust clung to his boots. The afternoon sun reflected softly off the metal buckle on his belt. None of it suggested cruelty. Only distance. Only a long road behind him. Her fingers slowly released the grains of wheat. They fell back into the rubble, almost invisible among the broken stones. She reached out with a hand that trembled slightly from weakness and took the chocolate. For a moment she simply held it, feeling its weight. It was heavier than the handful of grain she had collected, heavier than hope sometimes felt. Daniel watched without speaking. Anna brought the chocolate toward her mouth. The smell reached her before the taste did, sweet and unfamiliar after weeks of stale air and dust. She bit carefully, as though afraid it might disappear if she moved too quickly. The first taste made her pause. Sugar. Real sugar. Cocoa. Milk. Her eyes closed for a brief second as her body remembered something it had almost forgotten. Energy. Warmth. The quiet spark that food placed back into muscles that had been waiting patiently to wake again. She forced herself to chew slowly. Hunger encouraged speed, but experience warned against it. Too much food too quickly could make a weak body revolt. Daniel noticed the care in her movements and nodded slightly, the way one might acknowledge another person's skill at something difficult. After she swallowed, he spoke for the first time. His voice was low and calm. He spoke in English, knowing she might not understand, but trusting tone to carry meaning where words could not. The word safe came out softly. Safe. Anna did not know the language well, but the sound itself carried reassurance. She ate another small bite. Then another. Daniel leaned against a broken section of wall a few feet away, giving her space while she finished the chocolate. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the river, stretching long shadows across the square. A warm breeze drifted through the town, carrying the faint smell of wet soil from somewhere beyond the houses. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The quiet was not uncomfortable. It felt almost respectful, like the silence inside a church where people understood that some moments did not require explanation. When the chocolate was gone, Anna wiped her fingers carefully on the edge of her dress. Even the crumbs mattered. Daniel reached into his jacket again and removed a small metal canteen. He unscrewed the cap and offered it to her. Water. She drank slowly, 3 careful sips, and then returned it. Daniel took the canteen back and nodded once more. From somewhere down the street, another American soldier called out, his voice echoing faintly through the empty buildings. Daniel answered briefly and then looked back at Anna. For a moment, he seemed to consider something. Finally, he reached into his pack and pulled out a second wrapped item, smaller this time. A piece of bread from the field kitchen. He placed it gently on a flat stone beside her rather than handing it directly to her, as though the distance between them still deserved patience. Anna looked at the bread and then at him. He shrugged slightly, the gesture simple and almost shy, like a man offering an extra apple from his lunch without wanting recognition. The engine of the Jeep started somewhere down the street. Daniel straightened and brushed dust from his hands. Before turning away, he looked at Anna one more time. Not with pity, not with suspicion, only with the quiet recognition of one human being seeing another in difficult circumstances. Then he walked back across the square toward the waiting vehicle, his boots crunching lightly on gravel. Anna watched him go. The bread remained on the stone beside her, warm from the sun. She picked it up slowly, turning it over in her hands. In a world where so much had been lost, the small loaf felt almost impossible. She took a careful bite and tasted something even more surprising than sweetness. Kindness. The bread tasted different from the chocolate. Less sweet, more solid, the kind of food that asked a body to wake up slowly instead of all at once. Anna sat on the low stone beside the ruined bakery wall and ate in careful bites while the afternoon light stretched across the square. Every few seconds she paused, not because the bread was gone, but because her body needed time to remember what nourishment felt like. Hunger had its own rhythm. It taught patience better than any teacher. The small town around her remained quiet in the way abandoned places often were after long months of movement. Doors hung slightly open where wind had pushed them again and again. A broken bicycle leaned against a wall near the far corner of the square, its tires empty, but its metal frame still catching sunlight like something that refused to surrender its purpose. Anna finished the last piece of bread and brushed the crumbs from her palms. She noticed that her hands had stopped trembling quite as much. Not completely steady, but steadier. Even a small amount of food could change the mathematics of survival. She leaned her back against the warm brick behind her and closed her eyes for a moment. The warmth soaked slowly through the thin fabric of her dress and into her shoulders. Somewhere beyond the houses a church bell rang once, the sound echoing softly across the rooftops. It had not rung regularly in months, but sometimes someone climbed the narrow tower and pulled the rope out of habit more than ceremony, as if the town needed a reminder that time still existed. Anna opened her eyes again and looked toward the road where the Jeep had disappeared. Dust had already settled back over the tire tracks. War had taught people that soldiers rarely returned to the same place twice. Units moved constantly. Roads carried them forward and away like currents in a river. Yet something in the way the American soldier had looked at her lingered in her thoughts. Not pity. She knew pity when she saw it. This had been something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. The kind two strangers shared when they realized they understood the same problem without explanation. The sun slipped lower toward the western edge of the sky. Evening air began to move through the town, carrying cooler currents from the Elbow River a mile away. Anna slowly stood. Her legs protested, but they held. That alone felt like progress. She walked carefully across the square toward the narrow street that led behind the bakery ruins where a cellar entrance still existed beneath the collapsed building. It was not truly a home, but it was dry, and the stone walls kept some of the night wind away. As she descended the few uneven steps, she paused once to steady herself, placing her hand against the rough wall beside the doorway. The cellar smelled faintly of old flour and damp wood. That scent had been part of her childhood for years. The invisible perfume of bread rising in ovens upstairs. Now it remained only as a ghost of routine. She sat on the wooden crate that served as her chair and leaned back against the cool stone wall. For the first time in many days, the tight pressure in her stomach had softened. Her body felt heavier, not with fatigue, but with the small comfort of food beginning its quiet work. She closed her eyes again and drifted into a light sleep that came quickly and without dreams. Morning arrived with pale gray light slipping through the broken boards that covered the cellar window. Birds had returned to the town in recent weeks, and their voices carried clearly through the empty streets. Anna woke slowly and sat upright, noticing immediately that the dizziness she had grown used to was slightly weaker. Not gone, but less powerful. She climbed the steps out of the cellar and stepped back into the square. The air smelled fresh after the cool night, and thin mist hovered above the ground where dew had settled between the stones. She looked instinctively toward the road again. Nothing moved there. Only quiet houses and the distant line of trees beyond the town. Anna walked to the same section of rubble where she had searched the previous day and knelt again. Her fingers moved automatically across the broken bricks, brushing aside dust in careful circles. Old habits returned quickly. Grain was grain. Survival remained a daily calculation. Yet something had changed inside her mind. The world no longer felt entirely closed. Somewhere beyond the ruined streets, people still carried bread in their packs. Somewhere soldiers still shared chocolate without asking for anything in return. That knowledge rested quietly in her thoughts like a small light. Time passed. The sun rose higher. A light breeze carried the faint smell of river water again. Then, sometime near mid-morning, a sound appeared at the far edge of town. Low. Familiar. An engine. Anna froze for a moment, listening carefully. The sound grew slightly louder as it moved along the same road as the day before. Gravel shifted under tires. The vehicle slowed as it entered the square. Anna did not stand immediately. She simply lifted her head and waited. The Jeep rolled forward a few yards and stopped. The engine shut off. Silence returned for a second before a door opened with a short metallic click. Boots touched the ground. The same steady rhythm. The soldier walked across the square toward her, carrying something wrapped in brown paper beneath one arm. When he reached the broken wall, he stopped a few feet away, just as he had the previous afternoon. Daniel Carter looked at the woman kneeling among the bricks and gave a small nod of recognition, the simple greeting of someone acknowledging that yesterday had not been a coincidence. He held up the wrapped bundle briefly as though explaining the reason for his visit without needing words. Inside the paper were 2 small pieces of bread and a boiled egg from the field kitchen. Ordinary food by military standards. Extraordinary food in a town where ovens had gone cold months earlier. Anna looked at the bundle and then at him. Her expression did not change dramatically. Hunger had taught her restraint. But her eyes held a quiet question. Daniel placed the bundle gently on the same flat stone where the bread had rested the day before. Then he stepped back a pace, giving her room again. The morning sun reflected softly off the metal star on the Jeep parked behind him. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. The square held only the sound of distant birds and the soft movement of wind through the empty windows. Finally Anna reached for the paper bundle and opened it carefully. The egg was still slightly warm. She looked up at Daniel once more. This time the hesitation was smaller. Something like trust had begun its slow, cautious work. Anna peeled the shell from the boiled egg slowly, turning it in her fingers as thin flakes of white shell fell into the dust beside the stone. The egg was still warm from the morning kitchen, and the warmth traveled gently through her hands as if reminding her that somewhere not far away people were still cooking breakfast, still boiling water, still waking up in places where the routines of ordinary life had not completely disappeared. She removed the last piece of shell and looked at the egg for a moment before taking the first bite. The taste was simple and clean. Protein, salt, strength. Her body responded almost immediately, like a machine that had been waiting patiently for the right fuel. Daniel Carter stood a few steps away, watching the quiet efficiency with which she ate. He had seen that same careful pace before. Men in his unit who had gone too long without food during supply delays had learned the same lesson. Eat slowly. Let the body remember how to work again. The morning sun continued climbing higher, warming the cracked stones of the square. Dust drifted lightly in the air whenever the breeze passed through the empty streets. A piece of loose paper somewhere down the road rolled once across the ground and then stopped against a curb. The town was beginning to feel less like a battlefield and more like a place that had simply fallen asleep and had not yet been told that morning had arrived. Anna finished the egg and wiped her fingers carefully against the inside of the brown paper. She folded the paper neatly and placed it beside her. Nothing useful was thrown away. Paper could hold crumbs later. Even small habits carried value. Daniel noticed the movement and allowed a faint smile to appear for the first time. Not a large smile, just a small shift at the corner of his mouth, the kind someone makes when they recognize the same practical instincts they had grown up with on a farm. He stepped closer to the Jeep and leaned briefly into the open passenger door, retrieving something else from the seat. When he returned, he carried a metal cup filled with water. He held it out to her without speaking. Anna accepted the cup and drank slowly, the cool water washing away the dryness left by the egg and bread. When she returned the cup, their eyes met again. For the first time she spoke. The word came out carefully, her accent heavy but the meaning clear. Thank you. Daniel nodded once in understanding. He pointed lightly to his chest. Daniel. He said the name slowly, making the syllables clear. Then he gestured gently toward her in the same way. Anna hesitated only a moment before answering. Anna. The exchange of names felt strangely formal in the quiet square, as though two strangers had just introduced themselves at a train station instead of in the ruins of a war. Yet something important had happened in that small moment. Names turned strangers into people. Daniel glanced briefly toward the far street where his unit had established a temporary checkpoint earlier that morning. The town remained quiet, but he knew soldiers moved through these roads every hour, and questions were never far away when an American soldier lingered too long in one place. Still, he did not leave immediately. Instead, he crouched beside a flat section of stone and used a small stick to draw a simple shape in the dust. A map, rough lines representing the river, the road, the cluster of houses around the square. Anna leaned forward slightly, watching his hand move. Daniel tapped the drawing of the river and then pointed west. His finger moved slowly across the dirt until it reached a point beyond the edge of the small map. Camp, he said. The word was simple enough that she understood its meaning even without translation. A temporary American camp somewhere along the river road. He then pointed back toward the town and lifted his shoulders slightly, a gesture that suggested he would return when he could. Anna followed the lines of the drawing with her eyes. For a long time the outside world had felt distant, almost imaginary. Seeing it reduced to simple lines in the dust made it feel closer. Reachable. The breeze shifted again, and sunlight reflected off the Jeep windshield in a bright flash before fading. Somewhere nearby a door creaked open as an elderly man from one of the surviving houses stepped cautiously into the street to watch the unfamiliar vehicle. Daniel noticed the movement and stood up slowly. Tom was moving forward again. He brushed his hands together, scattering the dust from the map, and then looked back at Anna. His voice remained quiet, almost conversational, but the words carried a steady promise. You eat, he said slowly, emphasizing each word. You get strong. Anna understood enough English to catch the meaning. She nodded. The conversation required few words because the larger truth was already clear. Survival had become a shared project. Daniel walked back toward the Jeep and placed the metal cup on the dashboard before starting the engine. The vehicle rumbled softly to life. He rested one arm on the open door for a second longer, and looked across the square at Anna one last time before shifting the gear. The Jeep rolled forward slowly, tires crunching over loose gravel, then turned toward the road that led out of town. Anna remained beside the broken wall, the folded paper still in her hand, watching. The vehicle grew smaller as it moved away. The dust rose briefly behind the tires and then settled again. Silence returned to the square, but it felt different now. Not empty. Expectant. She looked down at the place in the dirt where Daniel had drawn the river and the road. The lines were already fading in the wind, but she could still imagine their shape. Somewhere beyond the trees, there was a camp. Somewhere along that road a soldier carried extra bread in his pack. Anna stood slowly and brushed the dust from her dress. Her legs felt steadier than they had the day before. The strength was small but real, like the first thin light that appears before sunrise. She turned back toward the ruined bakery and the cellar beneath it. Work remained the same. Survival still required patience. Yet as she descended the familiar stone steps, she carried something new with her, something lighter than food, but just as necessary. The quiet knowledge that someone in the world had decided she should live. Morning came earlier the next day, or perhaps Anna simply woke sooner because her body had begun to remember what energy felt like. Pale light slid across the broken stones of the square and touched the edge of the ruined bakery wall, turning the dust a soft gold. For a few seconds, she lay still on the narrow wooden crate in the cellar, listening to the quiet sounds above her. Birds again. 2 of them, arguing somewhere on the roof beams that still leaned across the collapsed bakery. Their voices were quick and bright, as if the war had never existed in their world at all. Anna sat up slowly. The familiar dizziness appeared for a moment, but then faded faster than it had the previous week. Food had begun to do its quiet work. Bread, an egg, chocolate. Not much by ordinary standards. Enough to change the direction of a body that had been drifting too close to emptiness. She climbed the short stone steps leading from the cellar and stepped into the morning air. The town looked almost peaceful in the early light. Windows without glass reflected the sky like empty picture frames. A small patch of weeds had begun growing between the stones of the square where no boots had passed for months. Even the broken bicycle near the corner looked less abandoned in the sunlight, as if someone might return for it at any moment and ride away down the quiet road. Anna walked toward the same place beside the bakery wall where she had searched for grain every morning since the winter. Habit guided her hands automatically as she knelt and brushed the dust aside from the broken bricks. Yet today her movements felt different, less desperate. The work was still necessary, but the pressure inside her chest had softened. Hope had a strange effect on the body. It slowed panic. It allowed the mind to think about tomorrow instead of only the next hour. She collected a few scattered kernels and placed them carefully in a small folded piece of paper she had saved from the day before. The paper already carried faint creases from where breadcrumbs had rested inside it. Nothing wasted. The sun climbed higher, warming the stones. Somewhere down the street a door opened slowly, and an elderly woman stepped outside with a broom made from bundled twigs. She began sweeping the dirt away from the front of her doorway in steady strokes. Sweep. Pause. Sweep again. The simple motion carried the quiet dignity of routine returning after a long absence. Anna watched for a moment and then returned to her work. Time passed. Nearly an hour perhaps. The square remained quiet except for the sound of the broom and the occasional call of birds. Then the now familiar vibration appeared again in the distance. An engine. Low and steady. Anna did not lift her head immediately this time. She had begun to recognize the rhythm of that particular vehicle. Gravel shifted on the road beyond the first row of houses. The Jeep rolled slowly into the square and stopped near the same place as the previous days. The engine shut off. Silence followed. A door opened. Boots touched the ground. Daniel Carter stepped into the morning light, carrying a small canvas bag slung over one shoulder. The bag looked heavier than the previous parcels he had brought. He walked across the square with the same unhurried pace as before, his boots leaving shallow prints in the dust. When he reached the bakery wall, he gave a small nod toward Anna, a greeting that had already begun to feel familiar despite the short time they had known each other. "Good morning," he said slowly. The words came carefully, as though he wanted the rhythm of them to carry meaning even if the language did not. Anna understood enough to respond. "Good morning." Her pronunciation was careful but steady. Daniel crouched beside the flat stone where he usually placed the food and set the canvas bag down. When he opened it, the smell of warm bread drifted into the air. 2 small loaves, a piece of cheese wrapped in cloth, and a metal tin containing something that rattled softly when he moved it. Apples, he explained, lifting the lid and showing the red fruit inside. Anna stared at the tin for a moment. Apples had once been so common that children carried them in their pockets after school. Seeing them again felt almost like seeing a piece of another lifetime. Daniel noticed her expression and shrugged lightly. "Supply truck," he said. His English words were simple, but the meaning was clear enough. Somewhere along the river road, American supply trucks still moved, bringing food from farms that war had not managed to reach. Anna picked up one of the apples and turned it in her hands. The skin was smooth and bright beneath the sunlight. She lifted it to her nose and breathed in the faint sweet scent. For a moment she did not eat it. Instead, she looked across the square toward the distant road where the jeep had appeared. The world beyond the town suddenly felt larger than it had the day before. Daniel watched her quietly and then reached into his jacket pocket. From inside, he removed a small folding knife. He opened the blade and sliced one of the loaves into thick pieces before handing the knife to her, so she could continue cutting if she wished. The gesture was practical, equal. Not the act of someone feeding a stranger, but the act of 2 people sharing a task. Anna accepted the knife and cut another slice of bread. The steel blade caught the sunlight briefly before disappearing again beneath the crust. She handed the knife back to Daniel, and they both ate in comfortable silence. Bread, cheese, apple, simple food. Enough to remind the body that strength could return slowly, one meal at a time. As they ate, Daniel pointed again toward the road leading west and traced a small invisible line in the air with his finger. Camp, river. He spoke the words again, reinforcing the small map he had drawn in the dust the day before. Anna nodded. She understood now. Somewhere not far away there was a place where soldiers slept in tents beside the water, where fires burned under metal cooking pots, where trucks arrived carrying crates of food and letters from home. The image formed clearly in her mind. When the meal was finished, Daniel stood and brushed the crumbs from his hands. He looked at Anna for a moment, and then spoke the sentence that had been forming quietly inside his thoughts since the first day he had seen her searching through the rubble. His voice remained gentle, almost protective. "You are safe now," he said slowly. The words were simple, but they carried a weight larger than the moment itself. Anna did not answer immediately. She simply held the apple in both hands and looked out across the square where sunlight filled the empty streets. For the first time since the war had reached this town, the future no longer looked like a blank horizon. Somewhere along the river road a camp waited. Somewhere nearby a soldier had decided that survival was something worth protecting. The apple tasted sharper than the bread and cheese, its crisp sweetness spreading slowly through Anna's mouth as she took a careful bite. Juice touched her tongue, and for a brief second, she closed her eyes. It had been months since she had tasted fruit that had not been dried, spoiled, or stolen from a field long after harvest. The flavor was bright, alive. She chewed slowly, letting the sweetness linger while the morning sun warmed the quiet square. Daniel Carter leaned back against the side of the jeep, arms resting loosely across his chest, watching the town with the quiet awareness of someone trained to notice movement even in still places. A few more townspeople had begun stepping out from the surviving houses. An elderly man stood near the doorway of a narrow brick shop that once sold shoes. 2 children, thin but curious, peeked around the corner of a doorway before disappearing again behind their mother's skirt. War had pushed people indoors for so long that even peace arrived cautiously. Anna finished the apple and wiped her hands on the folded paper she had saved. Daniel noticed the careful way she saved the paper again and nodded, slightly, as though acknowledging a shared understanding that nothing useful should ever be wasted. The breeze carried a cooler smell from the river now, and the sunlight reflected softly off the jeep's windshield. Daniel glanced down the road toward the west where the narrow dirt path curved through a row of tall poplar trees. Beyond those trees lay the American camp he had mentioned. Tents stretched along the riverbank there. Canvas kitchens. Supply trucks parked beside wooden crates stamped with black numbers. The place smelled of coffee in the mornings and would smoke in the evenings. A temporary village built by soldiers who never stayed long in one place. He turned back toward Anna. She was standing now, stronger than the first day he had seen her. The difference was small, but unmistakable. Her shoulders were no longer folding inward from exhaustion. Her eyes held more focus. Even the way she shifted her weight between her feet suggested energy, returning slowly to muscles that had nearly forgotten their purpose. Daniel pushed himself away from the jeep and stepped closer. He pointed gently toward the road again, then toward the town. "Work," he said, searching for the simplest word that might translate across languages. Then he made a small sweeping gesture across the square with his hand, mimicking the movement of the elderly woman who had been using the twig broom earlier. Clean. Fix. The meaning was clear enough. Life did not restart by waiting. It restarted by doing small things again. Anna followed his gesture and looked across the square. The woman with the broom was still working slowly in front of her doorway, pushing dust into a small pile beside the curb. Sweep. Pause. Sweep again. A rhythm of patience. Anna nodded. Yes. She answered quietly. Daniel smiled again, this time a little more openly. He walked back to the jeep and reached into the canvas bag once more. From inside, he pulled out a small cloth bundle tied with a thin piece of string. When he handed it to her, she opened it carefully. Inside were several small packets of seeds, wrapped in wax paper and labeled in English. Beans, carrots, lettuce. The tiny letters meant nothing to her at first, but Daniel crouched beside the stone again and drew quick shapes in the dust. A small square for a garden. Rows. Seeds placed carefully in the soil. Then he pointed to the ground near the edge of the square where sunlight reached most of the day. Plant, he said slowly. Grow. Anna stared at the seeds in her palm. During the long winter, people had spoken about gardens the way sailors spoke about distant islands. Something that might exist again someday, but seemed impossible in the present moment. Now the possibility sat quietly in her hand. Seeds were small promises. They carried the idea of tomorrow inside them. She closed the cloth bundle gently and looked up at Daniel with something that had not been in her expression before. Not just gratitude. Determination. Daniel stood again and brushed the dust from his hands. He glanced once more down the road toward the poplar trees. The sun had climbed higher now, and the morning was moving toward midday. Somewhere in the camp a whistle would soon blow for the soldiers to return to their assigned duties. He stepped back toward the jeep and rested his hand on the door. For a moment he hesitated. Then he spoke again, his voice low but steady. I will come back. The words were simple but deliberate. Anna understood them clearly. She nodded once. Daniel climbed into the jeep and turned the ignition. The engine came to life with its familiar rumble. As the vehicle rolled slowly across the square, he raised a hand briefly in farewell before guiding the jeep toward the western road. The tires crushed small stones beneath them as he drove between the rows of houses and disappeared beyond the poplar trees. Anna remained standing beside the broken bakery wall, the small cloth bundle of seeds still resting in her hands. The square felt different again after the jeep vanished. Not empty, busy with quiet possibilities. She looked toward the patch of soil Daniel had pointed out. It was nothing more than a narrow strip of earth between two cracked stones, but sunlight fell there almost all day. Slowly she walked toward it and knelt down. The soil was dry near the surface, but softer a few inches below. She dug carefully with her fingers, making small rows the way Daniel had shown her in the dust. When the first seed dropped into the ground, it disappeared instantly beneath the soil. Yet Anna knew it was there, waiting, growing. She pressed the dirt gently over the row and sat back on her heels. Around her the town continued its slow return to motion. The woman with the broom finished sweeping and leaned the tool against her wall. One of the children stepped into the street holding a tin cup and looked curiously toward the new garden patch. Far above the rooftops the sky stretched clear and blue over the river valley. Anna brushed the dirt from her hands and stood again. For the first time since the war had brought hunger into this square, she felt something that resembled the beginning of a future. The soil felt cool beneath Anna's fingers as she finished pressing the last line of seeds into the narrow strip of earth beside the cracked stones. The ground smelled faintly of rain, even though the sky above the town had remained clear for days. Somewhere deep in the soil moisture still waited, hidden from the sun, ready to wake the small promises she had just buried. She brushed the dirt from her hands and stood slowly, looking across the square again as if seeing it through different eyes than the week before. The broken bakery wall still leaned at the same tired angle. The bicycle still rested beside the curb. The windows still stared outward without glass. Yet something subtle had changed in the air. Movement had returned. The elderly woman with the twig broom was now speaking quietly with another neighbor who had stepped outside carrying a wooden bucket. Their voices were low but steady, the sound of ordinary conversation replacing the heavy silence that had filled the town through the winter. Two children crossed the square, chasing one another in wide circles, their shoes kicking small clouds of dust from the stones. Even the birds above the rooftops seemed louder this morning, calling from the poplar trees near the road as though announcing that the long, quiet season had begun to loosen its grip. Anna remained near the small garden patch for a while, studying the soil as if she expected the seeds to push through the surface immediately. Of course they did not. Seeds required patience, water, time. She understood this. Her father had once kept a garden behind the bakery where rows of beans climbed wooden stakes every summer. As a child, she had believed vegetables grew overnight because every morning the plants seemed taller than the day before. Now, she understood the slower truth. Growth happened quietly when no one was watching. The breeze shifted and carried the distant smell of river water through the square. Anna turned toward the bakery ruins and walked back toward the cellar entrance beneath the broken wall. Her steps were steadier than they had been only a few days earlier. Strength returned not in large bursts, but in small, steady increments. The body accepted food. Muscles remembered their purpose. Breath came easier. She paused halfway across the square and looked down the western road again where the Jeep had disappeared earlier that morning. Dust had already settled back over the tire tracks, but the image of the vehicle remained clear in her mind. Daniel Carter. She repeated the name silently. It still felt unusual to think of an American soldier by name instead of simply as part of an army that had once been described only through propaganda posters and radio speeches. Now he existed in her memory as a man who carried bread, apples, and seeds in a canvas bag. A man who drew maps in the dust with a stick and spoke slowly so his words could cross the barrier between languages. A man who had decided without explanation that her survival mattered. Anna returned to the cellar and gathered a small tin cup from the corner where it rested beside an empty flour sack. She climbed back into the sunlight and walked toward the public well near the edge of the square. The pump handle creaked softly as she pulled it down, and after a few strokes cold water began flowing into the cup. She drank slowly, then filled the cup again and carried it carefully back to the garden patch. The water soaked quickly into the soil, darkening the small rows where the seeds waited beneath the surface. She watched the earth absorb the moisture, imagining the tiny roots that would someday push downward through that darkness in search of the same water. A garden began with invisible work. She set the empty cup beside the stones and sat on the edge of the curb for a moment, letting the sunlight warm her face. The quiet rhythm of the town continued around her. The elderly woman had finished sweeping and now sat on a wooden stool outside her doorway, knitting something from a bundle of gray yarn. The children had discovered a small wooden hoop and were rolling it across the square with sticks, laughing whenever it tipped sideways. Their laughter carried lightly through the air like a signal that childhood itself had survived the long winter. Time passed slowly. The sun climbed higher. Shadows shortened across the stones. Anna returned to the well twice more, bringing water back to the small garden rows until the soil looked evenly dark. Each trip left her slightly breathless, but the fatigue was no longer frightening. It felt like honest work. As she poured the last cup onto the ground, she heard the faint sound of an engine again in the distance. The now familiar vibration traveled through the quiet streets long before the vehicle appeared. Anna stood and brushed the dirt from her hands, turning toward the road instinctively. The Jeep emerged between the tall poplar trees and rolled slowly into the square. Daniel had returned earlier than usual. The vehicle stopped near the same place beside the bakery ruins and the engine shut off. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Daniel stepped out and walked across the square, carrying something longer than the canvas bag he had brought before. It was a small wooden crate balanced against his shoulder. When he reached the garden patch, he set the crate carefully on the ground and lifted the lid. Inside were several short wooden stakes and a coil of thin wire. Anna looked at them curiously. Daniel crouched beside the garden rows and pushed one of the stakes into the soil near the edge. He stretched the wire between two stakes, creating a simple barrier around the patch. Birds, he explained, pointing briefly toward the rooftops where several sparrows watched the square with interest. Protect. Anna understood immediately. She helped him push the remaining stakes into the soil until a small fence surrounded the narrow garden. The wire glinted faintly in the sunlight. When they finished, Daniel leaned back on his heels and examined their work with the practical satisfaction of someone who had spent years fixing fences on distant farms. Anna stood beside him, looking down at the protected patch of earth. The fence was small. The garden was small. Yet together they had built something that did not exist the week before. Daniel stood and wiped his hands on his trousers. The breeze moved gently through the square. Again, carrying the smell of river water and distant fields beyond the town. He glanced toward the road that led back to the American camp, and then returned his gaze to the young woman beside the garden. The words he spoke were quiet but steady. It will grow. Anna followed his eyes to the soil where the seeds waited unseen beneath the surface. She nodded slowly. Yes, it will grow. The wire fence around the small garden glimmered faintly in the afternoon light. Thin lines stretched between wooden stakes that Daniel had pushed firmly into the soil. It was a simple structure, nothing more than a few lengths of wire and a handful of sticks, yet it changed the appearance of the square in a quiet but unmistakable way. Before, the patch of dirt beside the cracked stones had looked like another forgotten corner of a ruined town. Now it looked intentional, protected, a place where something had been chosen to grow. Anna stood beside the narrow rows of soil and looked down at the space they had built together. The seeds were still invisible beneath the surface, resting in darkness where roots would soon begin their slow search for water. Daniel followed her gaze and nodded slightly, the kind of nod farmers gave when they had finished planting and understood that the rest of the work now belonged to time and weather. The sun drifted slowly across the sky, warming the stones of the square until the dust carried the faint smell of dry earth. A soft breeze moved through the tall poplar trees near the western road, and their leaves made a gentle whispering sound that echoed between the empty houses. For a moment neither of them spoke. The quiet was comfortable now, not the silence of strangers, but the calm pause of people who had already shared several important tasks without needing many words. Anna crouched beside the garden and brushed a few loose clumps of soil away from the base of the stakes. Daniel noticed the careful attention she gave to the ground and felt a quiet sense of satisfaction settle inside his chest. The first day he had seen her in this square, she had been searching for individual grains of wheat between broken bricks. Now she was tending rows of seeds. The difference between those two actions measured more than hunger. It measured direction. From survival toward living again. Daniel glanced toward the road that curved away through the trees toward the American camp. The afternoon light suggested that several hours had passed since he had left earlier that morning. In the camp, soldiers would already be working through the routine tasks that filled their days between movements. Repairing engines, unloading supply trucks, writing letters to families who waited across an ocean. Life in the army moved forward whether one man paused for a moment in a quiet town square or not. Yet Daniel did not hurry. Instead, he crouched again and drew another simple picture in the dust beside the garden. This time the drawing was larger. He sketched a small house shape, a square with a triangle roof. Then he added several tiny squares beside it, each connected by lines. Anna leaned closer, watching his hand move across the ground. Garden, Daniel said, pointing at the rows of soil they had just protected. Then he tapped the small house drawing. Home. The words were simple, but the idea behind them was larger than the drawing itself. Anna studied the shapes in the dust for several seconds. For a long time the concept of home had felt like something that belonged to another era. A memory from before the war had turned streets into ruins and neighbors into refugees. Yet as she looked around the square now, she could almost imagine the buildings standing upright again. The bakery rebuilt, the well repaired, windows filled with glass instead of sky. The image was fragile, but it was there. Daniel brushed the drawing away with the side of his hand and stood again. The breeze carried a cooler scent from the river now, and the shadows of the poplar trees stretched longer across the road. Anna noticed the change in light and realized how much time had passed since the jeep had arrived. The afternoon was drifting toward evening. Somewhere in the distance a church bell rang once, its sound rolling gently over the rooftops before fading into the quiet. Daniel turned toward the Jeep and opened the passenger door. For a moment Anna thought he was preparing to leave again, but instead he reached inside and removed a folded blanket from the seat. The fabric was thick army wool, olive green with a narrow white stripe along the edge. He carried it back across the square and placed it on the stone beside the bakery wall. "Night gets cold," he said slowly. Anna understood immediately. The cellar beneath the bakery kept out the wind, but the stone walls held the chill of the ground after sunset. A blanket could mean the difference between a restless night and real rest. She lifted the wool in both hands and felt its weight. It smelled faintly of smoke and canvas, the scent of soldiers' camps along the river. For a moment, she looked as though she might protest, the instinct of someone who had learned not to accept too much from strangers. But Daniel simply nodded toward the cellar entrance, as if the matter required no discussion. "You need it," he said quietly. Anna held the blanket for a moment longer before folding it carefully over her arm. "Thank you." She spoke the words with greater confidence now, her accent still strong but the meaning clear. Daniel smiled again, then glanced toward the road where the afternoon shadows had begun to lengthen across the dust. He stepped back toward the Jeep and rested his hand on the door frame. The town remained calm around them. The children had moved to the far side of the square and were drawing lines in the dirt with sticks, inventing a game only they understood. The elderly woman who had been knitting earlier had returned inside her house, leaving the stool beside the doorway, as though she expected to sit there again tomorrow. Daniel looked across the square once more before climbing into the Jeep. As the engine started, the familiar low vibration returned to the quiet streets. Anna stood beside the small garden patch, the folded blanket resting against her arm, watching as the vehicle turned slowly toward the western road. The Jeep rolled past the row of poplar trees and disappeared again beyond the bend that led toward the river. Dust rose briefly behind the tires and then settled back onto the road. Anna remained beside the garden for several minutes after the sound of the engine faded. The evening light softened the edges of the buildings and turned the sky above the town a pale golden color. She walked once more around the narrow rows of soil, checking the wire fence Daniel had built and pressing a loose stake deeper into the ground with her foot. The seeds beneath the earth were still invisible, yet the space around them had changed. A garden now existed where only dust had been before. She looked toward the road one last time before turning toward the cellar steps beneath the bakery wall. As she descended into the cool shadows below, the wool blanket still folded carefully in her arms, she carried with her a quiet certainty that the town above was no longer waiting for the past to return. It was beginning, slowly and patiently, to build a future. The night settled gently over the town after the sun disappeared behind the line of poplar trees along the western road. Darkness did not arrive suddenly here. It crept slowly across the rooftops, softening the broken edges of the buildings and turning the empty windows into quiet mirrors reflecting the first pale stars. In the cellar beneath the ruined bakery, Anna unfolded the wool blanket Daniel had left for her and spread it across the wooden crate where she slept. The fabric felt thick and warm beneath her hands, heavier than anything she had owned in many months. She ran her fingers across the narrow white stripes stitched along the edge and breathed in the faint scent of smoke and canvas that clung to the fibers. It smelled like distant campfires beside a river she had not yet seen. For a long moment, she simply sat there in the dim light, letting the quiet surround her. The cellar walls still carried the familiar scent of old flour and damp stone, but tonight the air felt different. War had trained people to measure safety carefully. Yet wrapped in the blanket, she felt something close to comfort. Real warmth spread slowly through her shoulders as she lay down, the wool covering her against the cool breath of night rising from the ground. Sleep arrived more easily than it had for many weeks. When morning returned the next day, it brought a thin mist drifting across the square, the kind that appears near rivers when cool night air meets the first warmth of sunrise. Anna stepped out of the cellar with the blanket folded neatly over her arm and paused beside the garden patch. The wire fence still stood exactly as Daniel had left it, each wooden stake firm in the soil. She knelt beside the rows and brushed away a few grains of dust that had blown across the surface during the night. The seeds remained hidden beneath the earth, but she imagined tiny changes already beginning beneath the soil where roots searched quietly for moisture. She carried the blanket back into the cellar and returned with the tin cup she had used the day before. The walk to the well felt easier again this morning. Her steps were stronger, her breathing steadier. She pumped the handle until water splashed into the cup, and then carried it carefully back to the garden rows, letting the cool liquid soak slowly into the soil. Around her, the town continued its slow return to life. The elderly woman stepped outside once more with her twig broom and began sweeping the dust from her doorway. Two men appeared at the far end of the street carrying pieces of timber from a collapsed shed, speaking quietly as they worked. Their voices were low but purposeful. Work had returned. Even the children who had played in the square the day before were already awake, chasing a small wooden hoop along the edge of the road while laughing at the way it wobbled across the stones. Anna finished watering the garden and sat for a moment on the curb beside the patch of soil. The sky above the rooftops had turned a clear pale blue. She followed the line of the western road with her eyes, watching the empty stretch of dust where the Jeep usually appeared. Time passed slowly. The mist lifted from the square, and the sunlight grew stronger. Nearly an hour drifted by before the distant vibration of an engine reached the town again. Anna heard it long before the vehicle came into view. She stood instinctively and brushed the dirt from her hands, turning toward the road as the familiar Jeep rolled between the tall poplar trees and entered the square. Daniel Carter guided the vehicle to its usual place beside the bakery ruins and shut off the engine. For a moment he remained seated, studying the quiet town through the windshield, as though confirming that the calm he had seen the day before had remained through the night. Then he stepped out and walked across the square toward the garden patch. This time he carried a small metal kettle and two tin cups hooked together by their handles. When he reached Anna, he held up the kettle with a small smile. "Coffee," he said slowly. The word required no translation. The smell drifting from the kettle was rich and warm, the familiar scent of roasted beans that soldiers carried with them across continents. Anna accepted one of the tin cups and watched as Daniel poured the dark liquid carefully from the kettle. Steam rose gently into the cool morning air. She lifted the cup to her lips and tasted the bitter warmth. Coffee had once been a simple morning habit in the bakery kitchen upstairs where her father prepared bread before dawn. Now the flavor felt like a memory returning from a distant place. Daniel leaned against the Jeep and drank from his own cup while watching the square come to life around them. The men with the timber had begun repairing a doorway across the street, hammering nails slowly into place. The children paused their game long enough to stare curiously at the American soldier before returning to their hoop. Even the elderly woman sweeping the dust paused briefly and nodded in Daniel's direction before continuing her work. The town had begun to recognize him, not as an occupier, not as a stranger, simply as the soldier who brought food and tools and now coffee. Anna finished her cup and handed it back to Daniel, who placed both cups on the Jeep hood before reaching into the canvas bag behind the seat. This time he removed a folded piece of paper and spread it across the hood of the vehicle. It was a real map, printed with careful lines and symbols marking roads and rivers across the region. He pointed to the small town where they stood and then traced a line west toward the riverbank where the American camp waited beyond the trees. "Supply trucks travel here every day," he explained slowly, choosing his words carefully so she could follow. "Food, medicine, tools." Anna studied the map with quiet concentration. For months the world had shrunk to the boundaries of a ruined square and a cellar beneath a bakery. Now the map showed something larger. Roads stretching across the countryside. Villages scattered along the river valley. The war had not erased everything. Daniel folded the map again and returned it to his bag. He looked once more at the small garden beside the stones and then at Anna. "Stronger today," he said with a faint approving nod. Anna smiled for the first time since the Jeep had first appeared in the square days earlier. The expression was small but genuine. "Yes," she answered quietly. "Stronger." The morning continued to unfold slowly across the town square after the coffee cups were set aside on the hood of the Jeep. Sunlight spilled over the rooftops and settled across the broken stones, warming the dust until the air carried the faint smell of dry earth again. Daniel Carter rested one hand on the edge of the Jeep while he watched the small garden beside the bakery wall. The wire fence still stood straight. The soil remained dark from the water Anna had poured earlier that morning. Nothing had appeared above the ground yet, but Daniel knew how seeds worked. He had grown up watching them transform empty fields into rows of green that stretched for miles across Oklahoma farmland. Growth always began invisibly. Anna followed his gaze toward the garden and then looked down at her own hands. Only a few days earlier those hands had been shaking from hunger while searching through broken bricks for stray grains of wheat. Now they were steady enough to carry water from the well and shape rows of soil with patient care. She noticed the difference herself. The small tremor that had lived in her fingers had faded. Even the way she stood felt stronger. The body remembered how to live once it was given the chance. Across the square, the two men who had been repairing the doorway continued their work, fitting a piece of timber across the top frame while discussing something in low voices. Their hammer strikes echoed softly against the walls of the empty buildings. Tap. Pause. Tap again. The rhythm blended with the quiet laughter of the children rolling their wooden hoop across the stones. It was not the sound of a town before the war, but it was no longer the sound of a town waiting for the end either. Daniel pushed himself away from the jeep and stepped toward the garden patch. He crouched beside the wire fence and pressed one of the stakes deeper into the soil where the ground had loosened slightly from the water. Anna watched him work with the careful focus of someone learning a new language through motion instead of words. After a moment, she knelt beside him and pushed another stake firmly into the earth using both hands. Daniel nodded in approval. Good, he said simply. The word carried encouragement without ceremony. They worked together for several minutes, adjusting the wire where it sagged slightly between two posts. When they finished, Daniel leaned back on his heels and wiped the dust from his palms. The breeze shifted again, carrying the smell of river water across the square. Somewhere far beyond the poplar trees, a truck engine rumbled briefly before fading again into distance. Supply convoys moving along the river road. Life continuing beyond the small boundaries of this town. Daniel stood and walked back toward the jeep. When he returned, he carried a narrow wooden box from the rear seat. The box looked old and worn, its lid held closed by a thin metal clasp. He placed it gently on the stone beside the bakery wall and opened it. Inside lay several small tools. A hand trowel, a short hammer, a pair of gardening shears with wooden handles. Anna leaned closer, studying the contents with curiosity. Tools like these had once been common in every household. Seeing them arranged neatly inside the box felt strangely formal, like opening a cabinet of forgotten possibilities. Daniel lifted the small trowel and handed it to her. Plant deeper, he explained slowly, pointing toward the rows of soil. Roots go down. Stronger. Anna nodded and crouched again beside the garden patch. She used the tool carefully, loosening the soil between the rows the way Daniel demonstrated. The metal blade slid easily through the earth, breaking apart small clumps and allowing the water beneath to spread more evenly. Daniel watched for a moment and then stepped back, allowing her to continue alone. A teacher eventually stopped speaking and let the student practice. The square continued its quiet transformation around them. The elderly woman who had swept her doorway earlier returned carrying a small stool and sat beside the entrance of her house with a basket of yarn resting in her lap. She watched the work beside the bakery wall with calm approval, her knitting needles clicking softly together as she began weaving another length of gray fabric. Even the two men repairing the doorway paused briefly to look toward the garden before returning to their hammering with renewed focus. Small efforts encouraged larger ones. Anna finished loosening the soil and stood again. Brushing the dirt from her skirt, Daniel reached into the wooden toolbox and removed a folded cloth bundle. When he opened it, several small packets of dried herbs appeared inside. Parsley, dill, mint. He pointed toward the garden rows again, and then mimed the motion of sprinkling seeds between the lines already planted. More flavor, he said with a small smile. Food should taste good. Anna laughed quietly at that. The sound surprised both of them. It had been a long time since laughter had appeared in this square, and for a moment it seemed to echo against the broken walls like something unfamiliar. Yet it felt natural. Daniel handed her the herb packets and closed the toolbox again. The morning had drifted toward midday now. Sunlight stood high above the rooftops and shadows had shortened across the stones. Daniel glanced toward the western road where the poplar trees swayed gently in the breeze. He knew the camp would soon expect him back. Soldiers could disappear into quiet towns only for so long before someone began asking questions. Still, he remained where he was for another moment. He stepped beside Anna near the garden and looked down at the rows of soil where the seeds rested beneath the surface. His voice was quiet when he spoke again. First bread, then garden, next house. The words formed a simple sequence. Survival, growth, home. Anna followed his gaze across the square to the ruined bakery behind them. Its walls still leaned at uneven angles, but the stone foundation remained strong. She could almost imagine the ovens rebuilt there again someday. The smell of fresh bread drifting through the streets. Children waiting outside with coins in their hands. She turned back toward the garden and nodded slowly. Yes, she answered. Daniel smiled and stepped toward the Jeep. The engine started with its familiar rumble as he climbed behind the wheel. Before guiding the vehicle toward the western road, he looked once more at the young woman standing beside the small fenced garden in the middle of the square. The town was not healed yet, but it was moving. And movement, he knew, was how healing always began. The Jeep rolled slowly out of the square and disappeared once again between the tall poplar trees along the western road, leaving behind the low echo of its engine fading into the quiet countryside. Anna remained standing beside the garden for a moment after the sound vanished, her eyes following the empty road as dust settled gently back onto the surface of the stones. The town did not return to silence the way it had during the winter. Now the quiet carried movement within it. The two men repairing the doorway across the street continued their steady hammering. The elderly woman outside her house paused from her knitting long enough to look toward the garden again, nodding faintly as though acknowledging that something meaningful had begun to grow there. Even the children playing with their wooden hoop drifted closer, curiosity guiding their small steps across the square. Anna crouched beside the garden rows once more and studied the soil carefully. The seeds were still hidden beneath the earth, yet the ground looked slightly different than it had the day before. The surface had lifted in tiny places where the moisture beneath had softened the dirt. She ran her fingers lightly across the row, careful not to disturb the fragile changes taking place below. Growth moved slowly, but it had already begun. She stood again and picked up the small trowel Daniel had left behind in the wooden box. The tool felt balanced in her hand, its wooden handle smooth from years of use. She walked along the edge of the square where several loose stones had fallen away from the broken bakery wall and began clearing a narrow strip of soil beside the garden fence. If the first row could grow, perhaps another could follow. The work required patience. Each stone had to be lifted and set aside carefully so the soil beneath could breathe again. Sweat formed along her forehead as the morning warmed toward midday, but the effort no longer exhausted her the way it once would have. Strength had returned slowly, meal by meal, morning by morning. The body had remembered its purpose. Across the square the children had abandoned their hoop and now watched her work openly. One of them, a boy with dusty blonde hair and shoes that looked 2 sizes too large, stepped closer to the fence. He pointed toward the rows of soil and asked something in a quiet voice. Anna knelt beside him and used the tip of the trowel to draw small shapes in the dirt the way Daniel had done. Seeds. Plants. Food. The boy nodded slowly as understanding crossed his face. Within minutes, he had returned carrying a small tin cup from his house and carefully poured a splash of water onto the far end of the garden row. The gesture was clumsy but sincere. Anna smiled and guided his hand so the water flowed more evenly across the soil. Soon the second child joined them, holding a cracked clay pot filled with more water from the well. Without planning it, the garden had become something shared. The men repairing the doorway paused again to observe the small gathering beside the bakery wall. One of them set down his hammer and walked across the square carrying a short plank of wood. He pushed the plank into the ground beside the fence and used a nail to carve a rough line across the surface. Then he stepped back and handed the plank to Anna. The line resembled a simple plant sprout pushing upward through the soil. A symbol. A marker. Anna pressed the plank firmly into the ground beside the garden rows where everyone could see it. The town had placed its first sign of rebuilding into the earth. Time moved gently through the afternoon. The sun climbed high above the rooftops and the shadows shortened across the square. Anna continued clearing the second strip of soil while the children carried small cups of water from the well. Even the elderly woman eventually rose from her stool and shuffled slowly across the stones with a cloth bundle in her hands. Inside were several dried onion bulbs saved from the previous autumn. She placed them carefully beside the new row and nodded for Anna to plant them deeper in the ground. Anna accepted the bundle with quiet gratitude. The garden was growing before the first seeds had even sprouted. The hours passed almost unnoticed until the sound of an engine appeared once again along the western road. This time it was not the familiar Jeep alone. Two vehicles approached slowly between the poplar trees, their tires crunching across the gravel before entering the square. The first Jeep was Daniel's. The second carried two additional soldiers sitting beside wooden crates stacked carefully in the back. When the engines stopped, Daniel stepped out and looked across the square with visible surprise. The small garden he had helped build now stood surrounded by townspeople working together in quiet concentration. The wire fence remained intact. The second row of soil had been cleared. The wooden marker with the carved sprout stood upright beside the fence like a flag planted in new territory. Daniel walked slowly toward Anna while the other soldiers began unloading the crates from the second Jeep. Inside were sacks of flour, canned vegetables, and small boxes of tools meant for rebuilding nearby villages along the river road. He stopped beside the garden and studied the new row of soil before looking up at Anna. His expression carried a quiet pride that did not require words. The town had accepted the small beginning he had offered. Anna brushed the dirt from her hands and met his eyes with calm confidence. Around them the square continued moving with purpose. The children carried another cup of water toward the garden. The men returned to their doorway repair. The elderly woman settled once again onto her stool beside the house, knitting needles clicking softly in the afternoon air. Daniel nodded toward the second row of soil and then toward the crates being unloaded nearby. "More seeds tomorrow," he said gently. Anna followed his gaze across the square, where flour sacks and tools were now being placed carefully against the wall of the old bakery. The future had begun arriving not only through one Jeep, but through many hands willing to rebuild what had been lost. The afternoon light stretched slowly across the square as the second Jeep finished unloading its crates beside the ruined bakery wall. Wooden boxes thudded softly against the stones as the soldiers set them down one by one, careful with their movements as though the contents were more valuable than the simple wood that carried them. In a way they were. Inside those crates waited flour, tools, and supplies that could turn broken towns into living ones again. Daniel Carter stood near the garden fence watching the quiet activity spread through the square. Only a few days earlier this place had been silent except for the wind moving through empty windows. Now the space carried the steady rhythm of people working together. Anna knelt beside the second row of soil and placed the dried onion bulbs the elderly woman had brought into the ground with careful hands. Each bulb disappeared beneath a small mound of earth that she pressed gently into place. The children stood nearby, holding their tin cups, ready to bring more water whenever she nodded toward the well. The work felt almost ceremonial. Each small action carried the quiet understanding that they were rebuilding something more than food. They were rebuilding time itself. One of the soldiers from the second Jeep opened a crate near the bakery wall and lifted out several sacks of flour stamped with bold black letters from an American supply depot. The sight of the sacks caused a small stir among the townspeople watching from the edges of the square. Flour meant bread. Bread meant ovens could return to life. Daniel noticed Anna looking toward the sacks and stepped beside her near the garden fence. He pointed toward the broken bakery building that stood behind them, its stone foundation still firm despite the collapsed roof above. "Bakery," he said slowly. Anna followed his gesture and looked at the old structure. The memory rose immediately in her mind. Her father moving between the ovens before sunrise. The smell of rye bread drifting through the streets. Neighbors arriving with baskets to carry loaves home while the morning sky was still pale. For a moment, the ruined walls seemed to hold the echo of that life. Daniel crouched beside the fence and used a small stick to draw another simple sketch in the dirt. A rectangle for the bakery building, a square beside it for the garden. Then he drew several small circles along the edge of the square where the townspeople now stood watching the unloading of supplies. "People," he said quietly. "Working." Anna nodded. The idea felt larger than the drawing. Around them, the activity continued growing. The two men who had repaired the doorway earlier now carried a wooden beam toward the bakery wall, examining the remaining stones to see where it might fit into the old structure. The elderly woman rose from her stool again and walked slowly toward the flour sacks, touching the fabric with her fingertips as though confirming that the contents were real. Even the children had grown quieter, watching the movement of the soldiers with wide curiosity. Daniel stood again and walked toward the crates to help lift one of the heavier boxes from the jeep. Inside were hand tools wrapped carefully in cloth. Hammers, nails, small saws, everything required to turn broken timber into new frames and roofs. The soldiers placed the tools beside the flour sacks where the townspeople could see them clearly. No announcements were made. No speeches were needed. The message was already understood. These supplies were not just deliveries. They were invitations. Anna finished covering the last onion bulb and brushed the soil from her hands. She walked slowly toward the bakery wall where the flour sacks now rested in a neat row. For several seconds, she simply stood there looking at them. Flour had once been so common that she barely noticed its presence in the bakery storeroom. Now it looked almost sacred. Daniel stepped beside her and lifted one of the sacks slightly so she could feel the weight of it. 50 pounds, he said with a small nod. Enough for many loaves. Anna placed her palm against the rough fabric and felt the fine powder shift inside. The memory of kneading dough returned to her hands instantly. The movement was something the body never forgot. She looked toward the broken doorway of the bakery and then back at Daniel. Her voice was quiet but certain when she spoke. We can rebuild it. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the square where the townspeople now stood closer together than they had the day before. The men with the wooden beam were already measuring the width of the bakery entrance. The elderly woman had begun sorting small stones into a pile beside the wall. Even the children were stacking loose bricks into neat rows along the curb. The work had already started. Finally, Daniel nodded. Yes, he said simply. The sun continued drifting lower across the sky as the afternoon moved toward evening. Long shadows stretched from the poplar trees across the western road. The soldiers finished unloading the last crate and closed the back of the jeep with a firm metallic click. Daniel walked once more to the edge of the garden fence and looked down at the rows of soil where the seeds and onion bulbs rested beneath the surface. The wooden marker with the carved sprout still stood upright beside the fence, its simple symbol catching the golden light of the setting sun. Anna joined him there and followed his gaze across the garden rows and then toward the bakery wall where the flour sacks waited. The future no longer felt like something distant. It was already standing in the square, shaped by the hands of everyone gathered there. Daniel turned toward the jeep again as the other soldiers climbed into their vehicle to prepare for the return trip toward the river camp. Before leaving, he looked once more at Anna and then at the small garden beside the stones. His voice was quiet when he spoke. Tomorrow we start the ovens. Anna watched as the two jeeps rolled slowly out of the square and disappeared once again along the western road, leaving behind the warm glow of evening settling across the town. Around her, the townspeople continued moving among the flour sacks and wooden beams, already discussing how the bakery walls might rise again. And beside the cracked stones in the center of the square, the small garden waited patiently, holding the first green future of the town just beneath the soil. The evening settled softly over the town after the two jeeps disappeared once again beyond the line of poplar trees along the western road. The sound of their engines faded slowly into the distance until only the quiet rhythm of the square remained. The sun had begun to lower behind the rooftops, painting the broken walls of the bakery with long streaks of warm gold. For a few moments no one spoke. The townspeople stood beside the sacks of flour and the wooden beams as though they were looking at something fragile that might vanish if touched too quickly. Then the elderly woman who had spent the afternoon knitting stepped forward and placed her hand gently against the nearest sack of flour. The motion seemed to release something inside the square. The men who had carried the wooden beam earlier lifted it again and moved toward the bakery entrance. The children gathered the loose bricks they had stacked along the curb and began carrying them toward the wall two at a time. Anna remained beside the garden fence for a moment longer, watching the slow transformation begin. The small wooden marker with the carved sprout caught the last sunlight of the day, its simple symbol glowing faintly above the rows of soil. She crouched beside the garden and brushed her fingertips lightly across the earth. The seeds were still hidden beneath the surface, but something had changed. Along the edge of the first row, the soil had lifted slightly, forming a thin, uneven line that had not been there the day before. Anna leaned closer and gently moved a grain of dirt aside with the tip of her finger. A tiny green curve pushed upward from the darkness beneath the ground. It was barely the length of a fingernail, fragile enough that a strong wind might have bent it sideways. Yet it stood there quietly, the first visible sign that life had begun to return. Anna smiled and looked across the square where the others were already working beside the bakery wall. She stood and walked slowly toward them. The men had placed the wooden beam across the entrance of the building and were examining the remaining stone foundation to see where the next support might fit. One of the soldiers had left behind a hammer from the crate of tools, and its steady tapping echoed gently through the evening air as the first nail was driven into place. Tap. Pause. Tap again. The sound carried a kind of confidence. Anna stepped inside the bakery doorway and looked around the dim interior where the ovens once stood. Dust covered the stone floor, and pieces of the collapsed roof lay scattered across the room. Yet the shape of the space remained clear. She could still imagine the rows of bread resting on wooden shelves and the early morning light coming through the windows while the ovens glowed with heat. The men working beside her glanced toward the flour sacks waiting outside and then back at the empty oven frames. One of them laughed softly and shook his head as though amazed that such a day had arrived. The rebuilding began with small movements. Broken stones were lifted and carried outside. Loose beams were stacked neatly along the wall. The children continued bringing bricks until a new pile formed beside the doorway. Even the elderly woman joined them again, sweeping the dust from the bakery floor with her twig broom so the workers could see the stone surface beneath. Anna walked to the back corner of the room where the old oven had once stood and knelt beside the cracked bricks that formed its base. She pressed her palm against the stone and felt the cool weight of it beneath her hand. For a moment, she closed her eyes and remembered the warmth that had once lived there every morning. Then she stood again and picked up a loose brick from the floor. Without saying anything, she carried it to the front of the oven frame and set it carefully into place beside the others. One brick, then another. The light outside continued fading as the sun dropped behind the trees. Lanterns appeared in the square, lit by neighbors who had brought them from their homes. Their soft yellow glow spread across the stones and illuminated the work continuing inside the bakery. No one hurried. There was no need. The town had already crossed the hardest distance. Time had returned. Anna stepped back outside for a moment and looked toward the garden again. The tiny green sprout remained standing in the row beside the fence, its color bright against the dark soil. She walked over and knelt beside it once more, careful not to disturb the earth around the fragile stem. The breeze moved gently through the square, rustling the leaves of the poplar trees along the road. Somewhere far away, a truck engine passed along the river highway, its distant hum blending with the quiet sounds of rebuilding. Anna poured a small cup of water from the well and let it soak gently into the soil beside the sprout. The water disappeared quickly beneath the surface, feeding the roots that had begun their slow journey downward into the earth. She remained there for a moment watching the garden. Bread tomorrow. Garden growing. Bakery rising again behind her. The path forward had appeared one step at a time, each action so small it had almost seemed insignificant when it began. Yet together those steps had changed the entire square. Anna stood and looked once more toward the western road where the jeeps had disappeared earlier that evening. The dust had already settled over the tire tracks. Daniel Carter was somewhere beyond the trees now, back at the river camp where soldiers slept in rows of canvas tents and drank coffee beside small fires under the stars. He might not see the sprout in the garden until the next day. He might not hear the first loaf of bread crack open when it came out of the rebuilt oven. But Anna understood something clearly now as she watched the lantern light glow across the town. Sometimes the people who changed a place did not stay long enough to see the entire story unfold. Sometimes they only planted the first seed. She turned back toward the bakery doorway where the workers were setting the next beam into place and stepped inside to join them. Outside, beside the cracked stones of the square, the tiny green sprout lifted its leaves toward the darkening sky. The town had begun again.